The metallic creak of the heavy back door of Jerry's diner echoed through the narrow alleyway in Minneapolis as Tommy Richardson carefully balanced a plate of leftovers in his small hands. His blue eyes alert and determined searched the shadows between the dumpsters looking for his four-legged friend. Max, he called in a low voice using the name he had given to the street dog he had started feeding 3 weeks ago. A sudden movement behind a cardboard box revealed a spotted muzzle and bright brown eyes. The dog, an undefined mix of breeds with caramel brown fur, emerged cautiously from the shadows. His right ear was partially mutilated, a scar from a hard life on the streets, but his tail wagged gently as he recognized Tommy. Jerry Martinez, the owner of the diner, watched the scene through the kitchen window with a discreet smile. He was the only one who knew about the boys' daily ritual, allowing Tommy to keep some leftovers from the buffet to feed the dog after helping to clean the kitchen. "You're a good boy, Tommy," Jerry used to say. "You've got a bigger heart than a lot of adults I know." Tommy wasn't allowed to have animals at home. His mother, Amanda Richardson, had been working 2 jobs since his father abandoned them 3 years ago and barely had time to look after herself, let alone a pet. The part-time job at Jerry's Diner was Tommy's way of helping out with expenses and secretly looking after Max. While the dog ate, Tommy sat on the doorstep, watching Drake Street go by. The neighborhood had changed in recent months. Missing posters had started appearing on lampposts and community bulletin boards with worrying frequency. 3 children had disappeared in less than 2 months, all between the ages of 10 and 13. "Tommy," Jerry's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Your mom called. It's time to go home, buddy." The boy sighed, stroking Max's head one last time before getting up. The sun was beginning to set, painting the Minneapolis sky with orange hues that were reflected in the windows of the buildings. The shadows lengthened on the streets, and Tommy knew he had to hurry. On the way home, something caught his eye. A white van was parked near Riverside Park, a place that parents had been avoiding letting their children go to lately. The vehicle had no identification, just a small scratch mark on the side that vaguely resembled the shape of a lightning bolt. Tommy picked up his pace, feeling an inexplicable chill. His worn-out sneakers tapped against the concrete at an accelerated pace, and he could swear he heard the van's engine running in the distance. As he turned the corner onto his street, a familiar bark brought him to a halt. Max was standing there panting, as if he had run to catch up. The dog stood beside him, and together they walked the last few blocks to the Richardsons' house. Amanda stood on the porch, her arms crossed, and a worried expression on her face. "Thomas Andrew Richardson, do you have any idea what time it is?" Her voice carried more fear than anger. "With everything that's happening in the neighborhood, I'm sorry, Mom. I lost track of time, helping Jerry with the cleaning," Tommy replied, climbing the porch steps. Max stood on the sidewalk watching intently. Amanda noticed the dog and frowned. "Has that dog been following you?" "He just wants to be friends," Tommy replied hesitantly. His mother sighed, but before she could answer, a police car drove slowly down the street. Officer Michael Preston, a middle-aged black man, well known in the neighborhood, waved to them. He had stepped up his patrol since the disappearances. "Come on in, Tommy. We'll talk about this dog after dinner," Amanda said, leading her son inside. From his bedroom window later that evening, Tommy watched Max settle down under a nearby tree. The dog seemed to stand guard, his watchful eyes turned towards the street. Somehow his presence made Tommy feel safer. What Tommy didn't know was that Max wasn't there by chance. The animal's instinct had led him to protect the boy who treated him with kindness, and in the days to come this unlikely connection would become much more important than anyone could have imagined. Lying on his bed, Tommy thought about the white van, the missing children posters, and Max. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a familiar engine driving slowly down the street. Through the thin curtain, he could see the reflection of the lights of a white vehicle gliding silently through the night, like a lurking urban ghost. Max, from his position under the tree, watched the same vehicle, a low growl rising in his throat. The street dog and the kind-hearted boy were about to get involved in something much bigger than their daily routines of friendship and shared food might suggest. Night fell over Minneapolis, shrouding the streets in shadows and mystery. Somewhere in the city, other families mourned their missing children, while Tommy fell asleep under the silent watch of his four-legged guardian, unaware that his life was about to change forever. Tommy's routine at Jerry's Diner took on a new meaning that Thursday morning. As he cleaned the tables, his eyes constantly turned to the television set in the corner of the establishment where a local reporter was reporting on the disappearance of yet another child in the neighborhood. Kevin Martinez, 11, was last seen leaving the Minneapolis Public Library, the reporter announced. The photo of the dark-haired boy with a shy smile filled the screen, joining the growing list of missing children. Jerry turned off the TV with a heavy sigh. Tommy, today, I want you to go straight home after work. No detours, understand. The boy nodded, but his thoughts were on Max. The dog had become a constant presence in his life, appearing not only in the alleyway of the diner, but also near his school and occasionally standing guard in front of his house at night. During his break, Tommy found Max in the alley, as usual. Today, however, something was different. The dog seemed restless, his ears moving, constantly picking up sounds that Tommy couldn't hear. His alert eyes scanned the edges of the alley with unusual intensity. "What's up, buddy?" Tommy asked, stroking the animal's spotted fur. Max responded with a low growl, pressing his muzzle against the boy's hand. At that moment, Officer Preston parked his car next to the diner. The officer went in for his usual afternoon coffee, but his expression was more serious than usual. Tommy watched him talking quietly to Jerry, who occasionally cast worried glances in his direction. "Tommy," called Officer Preston, approaching the boy. "Have you seen anything different in the neighborhood lately? Anything that seems out of the ordinary?" The white van with the lightning scratch immediately came to mind, but something made him hesitate. "No, sir," he replied, avoiding the policeman's gaze. Max, who usually stayed hidden when strangers approached, emerged from the shadows and positioned himself next to Tommy, his demeanor surprisingly protective. Officer Preston arched his eyebrows, observing the interaction between the two. "Is that your dog?" asked the officer, studying Max with interest. "Not exactly," Tommy replied. "He's a friend." Officer Preston crouched down, holding out his hand for Max to sniff. The dog maintained his alert posture, but showed no hostility. "You know, Tommy, sometimes our four-legged friends notice things that we don't. They have a sixth sense for things. They have a sixth sense for danger." The policeman's words echoed in Tommy's mind for the rest of the day. While he was arranging the condiments on the counter, he noticed movement through the shop window. The white van drove slowly down the street, and this time Tommy was sure he saw someone watching the establishment through the tinted glass of the vehicle. Max, who was lying near the back in trance, immediately stood up, the hairs on the back of his neck bristling. A low, menacing growl emanated from his throat. "Jerry," Tommy called out, his voice shaking slightly. "That van, has it been coming through here a lot?" The diner owner frowned, moving closer to the window. "Now that you mention it, I've seen that vehicle a lot over the last few weeks." He paused, scratching his chin thoughtfully. "Coincidentally, since the disappearances began." Tommy felt a shiver run down his spine. His hand unconsciously reached for Max's, for seeking comfort in the animal's warmth. The dog pressed his body against the boy's legs, as if he understood his apprehension. That evening, as he walked home, Tommy noticed that Max was following him more closely than usual. The dog alternated between walking beside him and checking dark alleys and corners along the way. The white van was nowhere in sight, but its ghostly presence seemed to hover over the streets of the neighborhood. Amanda was on the balcony again, but this time her face softened at the sight of Max escorting her son. "So this is the famous dog," she said, descending the steps for a closer inspection. Max kept a respectful distance, but his tail wagged slightly in recognition. Tommy took advantage of his mother's receptiveness. "He protects me, Mom. He always accompanies me on the way home." Amanda studied the animal for a moment, noticing its scars and its protective posture. "Maybe," she began, surprising Tommy, "maybe we could find a place for him in the backyard. Temporarily, of course." Tommy's face lit up with a smile, but before he could reply, a distant scream cut through the night air. Max immediately turned in the direction of the sound, his ears perked and body tense. "Come in, Tommy," Amanda ordered, her maternal instinct kicking in. "And you," she turned to Max, "can stay here tonight." From that familiar window in his room, Tommy watched the lights of the police cars reflecting off the walls of the neighboring houses. Max remained at his post under the tree, his watchful eyes never ceasing to monitor the street. The boy didn't know it, but his connection with Max was about to become much more significant. The pieces of a dark puzzle were beginning to fit together, and a street dog he had rescued with leftover food would be instrumental in unraveling the mysteries that haunted the streets of Minneapolis. In the silence of the night, as sirens echoed in the distance, Tommy sensed that something bigger was coming. Max wasn't just a street dog, he was a guardian, a protector that fate had placed in his path. And together they were about to face something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. The scream that cut through the night before still echoed in Tommy's memory when he arrived at the diner the next morning. The local news had confirmed his fears. Lisa Chinten had disappeared on her way home from piano lessons. It was the fifth child in 3 months. "We need to talk," Jerry said as soon as Tommy walked in, his normally jovial face marked by concern. The diner owner closed the curtains and gestured for Tommy to sit down. "Officer Preston was here earlier. He wants to know about the white van you mentioned." Tommy's heart raced. Max, who had followed him into the cafeteria, approached and rested his head on his knee as if sensing his anxiety. "I think I saw the same van near Lisa Chen's school yesterday," Jerry continued, lowering his voice. "And I'm not the only one. Other shopkeepers in the neighborhood noticed it too." Tommy thought back over the last few days to the times he'd spotted the mysterious vehicle. Always stopped at strategic points near schools, parks, places where children used to go. "The scratch," he muttered. "There's a scratch that looks like lightning on the side." Jerry took out his phone and showed a blurry photo. Like this one, the image showed a white van partially captured by a security camera. On the side, even with the poor quality of the photo, it was possible to make out the characteristic mark. Exactly like that, Tommy confirmed, feeling a shiver run down his spine. Max let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the photo. At that moment, Amanda called the cafeteria. Her voice trembled slightly. "Tommy, I want you to come straight home today. Lisa Chen's school is only 3 blocks from yours." "I'll walk you," Jerry offered, but was interrupted by urgent knocks on the back door. Officer Preston hurried in, his uniform slightly disheveled, as if he had been running. "We found something," he announced, looking directly at Tommy. "We need your help." The officer explained that security cameras had captured the white van in a specific pattern of movement through the neighborhood. The vehicle always appears at the same times, following similar routes. "And tonight, they're going to try again," Tommy added, suddenly understanding. Max stood up, alert, as if he also understood the seriousness of the situation. Officer Preston nodded. "We need a decoy, but we can't risk another child. However, if we could predict where they're going to attack." "Riverside Park," Tommy said without hesitation. "They always pass through there when basketball lessons are over." The plan was drawn up quickly. Tommy, under undercover police protection, would walk through the park at the usual time for basketball lessons. Max, with his keen instincts and unwavering loyalty, would be a crucial element of surprise. Amanda was initially vehemently opposed to the idea, but after a long conversation with Officer Preston and seeing the determination in her son's eyes, she reluctantly agreed. "But on one condition," she insisted. "I want to be around too." As the sun began to set, Tommy walked through Riverside Park apparently alone. Max followed him discreetly, keeping to the shadows as instructed. Plainclothes policemen were strategically positioned, including Jerry, who had insisted on joining in. The familiar squeal of tires on asphalt made Tommy's heart leap. The white van approached slowly, its tinted windows reflecting the last of the day's light. Max, hiding behind a bush, began to growl softly. It all happened very quickly. The van stopped, its side doors opened, and 2 masked men jumped out towards Tommy. Before they could reach him, Max emerged from the shadows like a golden arrow, knocking one of the men down with surprising force. "Minneapolis police, freeze." Officer Preston's voice thundered through the park as cars appeared from all sides. The second man tried to run away, but Max was already on his tail, grabbing his leg hard enough to bring him down. Tommy watched dumbfounded as a street friend turned into a real hero. Amanda ran to hug her son, tears of relief streaming down her face. Jerry appeared soon after, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. "You have no idea what you've just interrupted," Officer Preston announced, handcuffing the suspects. "This is just the tip of the iceberg of a much larger operation." As the officers searched the van, they found evidence linking the criminals not only to the recent disappearances in Minneapolis, but to a child trafficking ring that stretched across 3 states. Max returned to Tommy's side, his spotted fur shining under the lights of the police cars. Amanda knelt down beside the dog, stroking his head gratefully. I think we need to revisit that temporary arrangement in the backyard, she said, smiling through her tears. Jerry watched the scene with satisfaction, knowing that his little diner had become the starting point for dismantling a criminal operation and, more importantly, for uniting a boy, a street dog, and an entire community around a greater cause. Night fell over Minneapolis, but this time the shadows seemed less threatening. Tommy hugged Max, feeling the comforting warmth of his furry hero, while the sirens of police cars echoed through the city, carrying with them the last remnants of the fear that had plagued the neighborhood for so long. The capture of the suspects in Riverside Park triggered a series of events that would transform not only Tommy's life, but the entire Minneapolis community. The next morning, Jerry's Diner became the center of attention when Officer Preston arrived with surprising news. We found documents in the van, explained the officer, spreading photographs out on the counter. They had detailed information on dozens of children, including their daily routines. Tommy recognized familiar faces in the photos, including Lisa Chun and Kevin Martinez. Max, now wearing a makeshift collar made by Amanda, remained alert at Tommy's side. The dog had become a local celebrity after the rescue story hit the news. People stopped in the street to pet him, and some even brought special treats for the canine hero. The men started talking. Preston continued, lowering his voice. The operation is bigger than we imagined. They have connections in Chicago and Detroit. Minneapolis was just the beginning. Jerry poured coffee for everyone, including Amanda, who had taken the morning off from work to follow developments. The diner owner looked upset. I should have noticed before. The van always parked at the same times, always watching. Don't blame yourself, Amanda intervened, putting a comforting hand on Jerry's shoulder. Thanks to your diner, Tommy and Max, we were able to prevent more children from going missing. A reporter from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune entered the diner, carrying a camera and a notepad. Sorry to intrude, but this story needs to be told. A kid and a street dog dismantling a drug ring, it's extraordinary. Tommy felt uncomfortable with the attention, but Max approached the reporter curiously, sniffing his pants. The man crouched down, taking a photo of the dog. What's his story? How did you meet? As Tommy began to tell him about his first interactions with Max in the alley, Officer Preston received an urgent phone call. His face tensed as he listened. We need to go to the police station, he announced after hanging up. They found something on the mall's security cameras. At the Minneapolis Police Department, Tommy and the others were taken to a conference room where several screens showed surveillance images. A detective, Susan Morrison, pointed to a specific sequence. Watch this, she said, pausing the video. 3 weeks before the first disappearance, the same white van appears in the mall parking lot. But look who's driving it. Tommy felt his stomach turn as he recognized the driver. It was one of the mall security guards, someone who often stopped by Jerry's for coffee. Robert Collins, Preston confirmed. He worked as a security guard at the mall for 5 years. He had access to all the cameras, all the entrances and exits. He was the perfect man to map the children's movements. Max, who had accompanied everyone to the police station, started barking when he saw Collins' image on the screen. Jerry paled. He always asked about the kids who went to the cafeteria. I thought it was just security concerns. Detective Morrison continued, Collins is at large, but thanks to the information we found in the van, we know where he might be. We have teams in 3 states ready to take action. Tommy remembered all the times he had seen Collins watching the children in the mall, his apparently protective gaze now revealed as something much more sinister. Max had reacted differently to him from the start, always standing between Tommy and the security guard when he visited the snack bar. Animals have a sixth sense for bad people, Amanda commented, stroking Max. He knew all along. The next few hours were intense. The police organized a special task force, and Tommy was asked to identify other places where he had seen the white van. Max followed his every move as if he understood the importance of their joint mission. You make quite a pair, observed Detective Morrison, watching the interaction between Tommy and Max. Sometimes heroes come in the most unlikely packages. Jerry closed the diner earlier that day, turning it into a makeshift operations center. Maps were spread out on the tables, marking the spots where the children had disappeared and the places frequented by the van. Look at this, Tommy pointed to the map. All the disappearances happened within a 3-kilometer radius of the mall, and always on days when Collins was on duty. Preston nodded, impressed by the boy's observation. You have a future as an investigator, Tommy. As evening approached, the tension in the diner was palpable. Somewhere in that city, Collins was still free, possibly planning his next move. But now, thanks to a 12-year-old boy and his faithful canine companion, his net was unraveling. Max positioned himself near the window, his watchful eyes scanning the dark street. Tommy knew that his friend would remain vigilant, protecting not only him, but all the children in the neighborhood. Somehow fate had brought together a lonely boy and a street dog, turning them into the unlikely heroes Minneapolis needed. Their story was far from over, but one thing was certain: Tommy's kindness in feeding an abandoned puppy had triggered a series of events that would change the lives of many families forever. And Max, the four-legged guardian, would continue to be by his side every step of the way. The next morning brought a renewed sense of urgency to the city of Minneapolis. As the sun rose over the downtown buildings, police teams from 3 different states were coordinating one of the largest operations against child trafficking ever seen in the region. At the center of it all, an unassuming diner had become the investigation's unlikely headquarters. "We've got a lead on Collins," announced Detective Morrison, hurrying into Jerry's diner. A toll booth camera captured the white van heading towards an abandoned industrial area on the outskirts of town. Tommy, who had insisted on staying involved in the investigation, was intently studying the digital map projected on the wall of the diner. Max, lying at his feet, raised his ears as he heard the growing movement in the establishment. Here, Tommy pointed to a specific area of the map. "That abandoned old paper mill complex. I remember Collins always talking about how that area was wasted and should be put to better use." Officer Preston approached the map, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "The boy is right. That area has a lot of abandoned warehouses, easy access to the main roads, and most importantly, it's been practically deserted for years." Amanda, who was now taking an active part in the investigations, brought fresh coffee for everyone. Her expression alternated between pride in her son and concern about the dangerous consequences of the situation. "Tommy, are you sure about this?" "Absolutely, Mom," replied the boy, his hand unconsciously reaching for Max's hair to calm himself down. "Collins always showed a strange interest in that area. Now we know why." Jerry, who had turned his diner into a base of operations, began marking specific points on the map. "These are all the places where the children were last seen. If we draw a line..." His words died when he realized that all the routes converged on the industrial area. "We need to act now," declared Detective Morrison. "If Collins realizes we're closing in, he might try to move again, and we'll lose our chance of finding the missing children." The team began to draw up a detailed plan. Tommy, despite his mother's protests, insisted on taking part. "Max knows his scent," he argued. "He can guide us better than any equipment." Detective Morrison considered the suggestion for a moment. "The boy has a point. That complex has dozens of sheds. A dog with Max's nose could make the difference between finding them today or wasting days looking in the wrong place." "But we'll keep Tommy at a safe distance," added Preston, firmly looking at Amanda for approval. "He and Max will stay on the outer perimeter with a support team." As the afternoon progressed, several undercover vehicles positioned themselves strategically around the industrial complex. Tommy and Max were in a surveillance van with Officer Preston and 2 other policemen watching through monitors as the tactical teams moved silently between the abandoned buildings. "Movement in Shed 7," whispered a voice on the radio. Visual confirmation of the white van. Max began to get agitated, his eyes fixed in the direction of the aforementioned shed. Tommy recognized this behavior. It was the same the dog displayed whenever Collins was around. "He's there," Tommy stated with conviction. "Max feels it." The operation unfolded quickly after that. As the SWAT teams approached the main shed, Max began barking insistently, pulling his collar towards a smaller, seemingly insignificant building. Esper and Tommy called out to Preston. "Max never acts like that for no reason." The policeman hesitated for a moment before speaking into his radio. "Team B, check the East Annex. Possible secondary location." The dog's intuition proved correct once again. While the main team was arresting Collins' cronies in the main shed, muffled screams were heard coming from the smaller building. There, in an underground room, the missing children were found, including Lisa Chun and Kevin Martinez. Collins, trying to escape through a maintenance tunnel, was surprised by Max, who chased him and immobilized him until the police arrived. The criminal, finally captured, looked in disbelief at the dog that had destroyed his operation. A boy and a mongrel, he muttered bitterly as he was handcuffed. Who would have thought it? As the dust settled and families began to gather with their children at the local hospital, Tommy watched the scene with a mixture of relief and pride. Max, now wearing an official Minneapolis Police Department collar, a gift from Officer Preston, stood vigilantly by his side. "You know," said Detective Morrison, approaching the two, "we're thinking of establishing a special K-9 unit for missing persons cases. After proper training, of course." She smiled, looking meaningfully at Max. Amanda, who had arrived at the hospital with Jerry to follow the events, hugged her son tightly. "I guess I don't have to worry about having a dog in the house anymore, do I?" Tommy smiled, stroking Max's head. From a simple act of kindness, feeding a street dog, a partnership had been born that had changed not only their lives, but an entire community. As the families hugged and tears of joy were shed all around, Tommy realized that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are exactly the ones we need most. A month after the operation that dismantled the child trafficking ring, Jerry's Diner was unrecognizable. The small establishment had become a meeting place for the community, with framed photos on the walls telling the story of the rescue. The largest of them showed Tommy and Max next to Officer Preston, taken on the day the dog officially received his honorary badge from the Minneapolis Police Department. "I still can't believe our Max is officially a K-9, Tommy commented, pouring fresh water into the personalized bowl Jerry had made, decorated with a small replica of his police badge. The transformation wasn't just limited to the diner. The whole neighborhood had changed. Neighbors who barely said hello to each other now organized community patrols, and a new surveillance system connected merchants and residents through an app developed especially for the area. Amanda entered the diner carrying shopping bags. Since Tommy and Max had become local heroes, she had managed to reorganize her life, only taking a full-time job that allowed her to spend more time with her son. "I brought the new vest," she announced, pulling out a navy blue piece of equipment with the initials K-9 in reflective letters. Detective Morrison said he needs to wear this during training. Max, who was resting near the counter, immediately stood up when he saw the vest, wagging his tail enthusiastically. The street dog had become a respected member of the police force, taking part in specialized training 3 times a week. Speaking of training, Jerry interrupted, wiping his hands on his apron. "Have you seen today's paper? Your story has inspired other cities to implement similar programs." Tommy picked up the Minneapolis Star-Tribune that Jerry was offering. On the front page, a story detailed how other communities were adopting dogs rescued from the streets to assist in police operations, especially in cases involving missing children. Officer Preston entered the diner, accompanied by Lisa Chun and her family. The girl, one of the rescued children, ran to hug Max, who responded with affectionate licks. "We've brought you a surprise," announced Mr. Chun, carrying a large decorated box. Inside was a commemorative plaque that would be installed in Riverside Park, renaming it Max and Tommy Park, guardians of the community. "That's not all," added Preston, his eyes shining with pride. "The mayor has approved the creation of a special child protection program inspired by what happened here. Each district will have a dedicated K-9 unit, and guess who's going to coordinate the training?" Tommy looked at Max, who maintained his characteristic attentive posture even during the celebrations. The bond between them had strengthened even more after the dramatic events, and now they both had a greater purpose. "And there's more," Preston continued, taking a seat next to Tommy. "Remember that tunnel Collins tried to escape through? The investigation revealed a network of underground passages connecting various points in the city. Without Max's nose, we might never have discovered it." Detective Morrison arrived shortly afterwards, carrying a thick folder. "The latest reports are in," she announced. "The operation in Minneapolis led to the identification of similar cells in 12 different states. The FBI is using our findings as a model for investigations across the country." Jerry began serving slices of a special cake he had prepared for the occasion, decorated with the chocolate dog's paw. The cafeteria was full of people who had become a key part of this extraordinary story. "Do you know what impresses me the most?" commented Amanda, watching her son interact with Max and the other children who filled the establishment. "How a simple act of kindness can trigger something so big." Kevin Martinez, another of the rescued youngsters, shyly approached Tommy. "My parents let me adopt a dog from the shelter," he said, smiling. "I wanted you and Max to help us choose." The news provoked a wave of smiles. The local shelter had seen a significant increase in adoption since Max's story had become public. People began to see street dogs not as problems, but as potential heroes waiting for a chance. It's amazing how things have changed, reflected Jerry, observing the movement in his diner. The establishment had become more than a place to eat. It was a symbol of how a community could come together and transform itself. Tommy tied Max's new vest carefully, adjusting the ribbons. The dog stood perfectly still, as if he understood the importance of his role. His eyes, once wary and cautious, now shone with a serene confidence. "Ready for another day's work, partner?" Tommy asked, stroking his friend's head. Max responded with a soft bark, as he always did when he was in agreement. Together they walked to the door of the diner, where a new sign had been installed: "Minneapolis Home for Heroes, where kindness makes a difference." Tommy and Max's story would continue to inspire people far beyond the borders of Minneapolis. The boy who fed a street dog and the animal who gave back by saving an entire community had proven that the greatest acts of heroism often begin with the simplest gestures of compassion. And so, as the afternoon sun bathed the now safer streets of Minneapolis, Tommy and Max moved on, ready for their next adventures as guardians of the city. No longer alone, but supported by an entire community that had learned the true meaning of protection, unity, and unconditional love.